Welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast. I'm John Buckley.
My name is Holly Ferguson. This is the podcast where we explore the challenges and possibilities of creating a fatality-free future. Today, we're joined by James Sullivan. Welcome.
Thank you.
You are going to help us step into the space of SIF investigations today, James. But first, I wanted to provide a little bit of a background about yourself. You provide services to health and safety teams and to operational leaders with a focus on building capability, coaching, facilitation, and developing and implementing improvement programs. You've worked across industries in both the UK and Australia. You now have your own consulting services, which is very exciting. But before that, you were principal of investigations and learning at a major mining company. And I would just love to hear, after, having such a rich career, what brought you into it? How did you get started in investigations?
Okay, well, I suppose that starts with being in a safety role, because when you're in some sort of a safety role in any organisation, part of your job is to do investigations, and that's something that I had to start doing very early on in my safety career, and found that I really enjoyed that part of the job, particularly the part because you're helping people out when things have gone wrong, either unexpectedly wrong or they've just gone wrong in general, and people need a bit of help to get things back on track again. Even if there was no really significant injury or damage that's occurred, people still want you to help them get back on track and work out how to make their work easier to get right, harder to get wrong. And investigations are a really good way of helping people in organisations learn from the work that they do.
Everyone's got a different experience with investigations, haven't they? Especially from a safety function point of view. And some see it as quite a chore, but others have actually stepped in and enjoyed the process of engaging with the work and understanding what's going on.
And I work with a lot of safety advisors, safety specialists in organisations, and some of them really enjoy doing investigations and others don't. And it is certainly something that people can have a preference for doing or not. And because the other thing is that the people who are involved in the investigation, often you have operational leaders in investigations, and some of those are really good at it, and others aren't so good at it or just don't want to be doing that sort of work.
That's why I like having James around, because it's not something that I like to do a lot of. I like going out and coaching leaders, but James does a great job of helping teams with their investigation process. Definitely not something I'm definitely leaning into as much as you do.
I'm intrigued about what it was like working and being a principal of such a large organisation. Was there lots of intricacies in your last role and managing multiple teams?
So it's more about how do you get groups of people from across a large organisation to share the same perspective you have about how you can get better at investigations. And so my role was very much one of influencing others. I had no direct reports. And so it was about bringing, for me, the success of that role, which was about helping a large organisation improve their investigations, was about how do you bring a community together with a shared view of what they want to achieve. That's difficult, and it just requires constant effort and conversation and being really clear on what you're trying to communicate. Sometimes it's really hard to see where you are, what you're achieving out of those sorts of roles with large organisations, because there's so much else going on.
And in that influence, did you find there was a need to not just influence in regards to the investigations themselves, but just some of the purpose behind why we do investigations, and the organisation actually having a reasonably consistent thinking about it?
Yes, because people do investigations for any number of different reasons. It can be because the regulators ask you to do one. It can be because your procedures tell you have to do one. It can link into the fact that your classification processes around events, so where you're classifying events, some will need investigating, some won't. What I've found is that very rarely are people able to say, I just want to learn from this event. There's always other reasons why they're doing investigations, and those other reasons tend to drive how you go about doing the investigation, and in many ways limit how open you can be to just learning from something that's happened that you were either surprised by or intrigued by and you want to learn more about. And instead what they can become is a bit of a compliance activity. I have to get this report done in this many days. It has to look like this, and so I'm just going to get it done. And certainly for a lot of operational leaders and safety people, they won't have just one investigation on the go at any one time. They've got multiple investigations, and so it becomes a task to get done rather than an opportunity to learn, which is what what we all talk about investigations being, but often they're not.
Because learning takes time. Like, you need to take the time to think and engage and gather evidence and go through that process. It takes time, and sometimes investigation processes aren't conducive to that being time.
No, they're not. And rarely do I find people allow the time to do that work well. In particular, when it comes to the data collection piece, that always takes a lot of time. And very often people in operations and businesses are just trying to get through it in order to get to the next stage, which is analysing that data. And so they come to doing things like timelines and 5 whys, and they've not actually collected the data to enable them to do a good analysis. So they can't work out what has actually happened very well or what they want to improve upon because they don't have the information.
So they either have missing information in that process, or they sometimes make that up to fill the gaps.
They fill the gaps and fill the gaps on what they know or what they think they know. Whenever any of us go and do investigations, we go to them with a pre-existing bunch of biases, preferences, a whole worldview around how we see safety, how we see people in workplaces, how we think about all of that. And those biases, those preferences will dictate what sort of information we want to go and collect, what information we don't bother collecting, and then how we look at that information and the assumptions we can make about that information because of our own personal worldview.
I'd like to touch a bit more on learning-focused investigations in a little bit, but first I wanted to understand, how do we look at investigations and incidences and I guess alter our approach between those with SIF potential and those that only resulted in maybe something minor? How do we adapt our investigations in that sense?
Most organisations that I have worked with or spoken to people in have some means of classifying the events that occur in their organisation, because everybody reports an awful lot. You can't investigate it all, so they all have ways of sifting through and saying, okay, this is something that we thought had a fatality potential, this one didn't have fatality potential, and they almost always will lean towards investigating the ones with a fatality potential rather than the minor ones as a preference. But because we're also dealing with injury management and recordable injury tracking and counting and performance measures like that, there is also a desire in organisations to investigate the minor event. And so if you ask anyone, they'll say we want to investigate the things that have fatality potential. That's the priority. The reality for a supervisor or a superintendent in a mining company like I'm dealing with most of the time is they are investigating all sorts of minor and significant events. And they don't just have the opportunity to say, here's a significant event that I really want to understand better. It had fatality potential and therefore I want to investigate that more than the minor recordable injury. I think people make an individual judgment as they go through a process as to how much effort they put in to some of those. It's influenced by the people around them, but often they will adjust how they investigate an event based on their own perception of whether that was important or not. That often aligns with whether it was a SIF or not. Sometimes it doesn't.
We speak about how organisations need to have a process for defining or identifying in their organisational context where fatality potential exists anyway, and therefore then if an event's happening in that context, more often than not there can be some descriptors around there that help them move the personal I think it is versus no, our organisation says it's in this context, it generally needs to be addressed that way.
That whole is this a SIF, isn't it a SIF, consumes so much time for organisations, as does the classification process. It's one of the things that reduces the thoroughness with which people can go and do an investigation, because they have a deadline, usually something like 28 days to get an investigation done. And then organisations and the people in those organisations will spend 14 days trying to decide, was it a SIF, wasn't it a SIF? Yes, they need to have those processes to make that decision. They've got to get good at using them so that they're not spending all this time up front making a decision on whether or not it's something that they're going to investigate.
So how do you get good at using something that they might not be using those skills pretty regularly, hopefully, if these events aren't occurring?
Talking about investigations or the classification process?
Classification.
I think you have to make it much simpler than most organisations do. Yeah. You have to make it simple and intuitive for people to understand if you're going to do it. And unfortunately, often because people don't like the outcomes of the way things get classified, or they don't like the numbers of certain types of event that they're having, organisations start to put in place really complicated ways of making that decision. And so you'll see flowcharts of how to make a decision, whether it was a SIF or not a SIF, whether it was a near miss or a hazard. You see matrices of different types of risk types and risk levels and descriptions of it was a level 1 event, a level 2 event, a level 3 event, and that just makes it complicated. When really what you're asking people to decide is, do you think that this event could have killed somebody? That's not hard, but we make it much, much harder than it needs to be.
Yeah, it's pretty common, and we talk about it a lot, right? That sometimes we make things a lot more complicated than they need to be, when actually just trying to keep it at its simplest intent can be the best place to start.
If we were to trace an event back to a specific control weakness rather than a surface level cause, how would we do that?
All investigations follow much the same approach when they're done in organisations. And what I try to encourage people to do is to hold off on leaping into the analysis stage and spend your time on the earlier stages of that investigation approach. So those stages are generally, we have some immediate actions where we see that an event has occurred and we respond to it. We do some planning to think about how we're going to investigate this. We then go and do some data collection. Once we've got that data, we then look at how do we organise that data into something like a timeline. And then we do an analysis. From the analysis, it then goes into coming up with actions and then sharing. At every stage along that process, there is an opportunity to focus in on controls and on fatality potential events, and to keep your attention where you want it to be. For me, I'm always asking people to make sure their attention is on people at all of those stages, and to try and make sure that people are looked after and cared for during that process. As you get towards the end, you're going to start to make some decisions about everything that you've uncovered, everything you've discovered, what matters most to you. And that's going to depend on the plan you put together at the beginning, what your scope was. Sometimes that's going to be the control measures and how you want to improve those. Sometimes it might be more about how people relate to each other and how they interact with each other. It might be more about the culture of the organisation and how you're going to make a difference there. You will inevitably find things that you want to improve around the controls that you have for your fatality risks.
That's the goal most organisations, from my experience, to try set out to do. I think sometimes they get a bit trapped when in the early essence the behaviour of someone just seems so obvious that it's hard to keep looking a little bit further than that. Is that what you've sort of experienced as well?
Always hard. People are upset when something's gone wrong, even if it's only very minor. So if you imagine a very minor event where no one's particularly got hurt, but someone who's operating equipment has made a mistake, and often there'll be someone who has 10, 15, 20 years experience. They are devastated they've made a mistake. People around them are equally surprised and upset that someone's made a mistake. It's much easier if we look to those individuals and why they did something wrong, what their so-called behaviours were at the time. That's so much easier than stepping back and thinking, how come they made that mistake? How has the organisation set them up to fail in some way? That's harder to do. Instinctively, as human beings, when something goes wrong, we look to blame people. We look to find a scapegoat because that helps us to reduce our feeling of uncertainty and get ourselves as a group of people back on track. And so it's human nature to find someone to blame. And in safety investigations, we do that through the language we use around behaviour, individual and team actions and mistakes that people have made, human error. It's all the stuff of blaming individuals, which is just going to make us feel better after something's gone wrong.
And I think that's sort of the trap sometimes of the way these investigation process, like I say, they all use different process but similar in nature in how you describe them as a process flow. But when they start to just, everything's got to fit into a box, it can be very easy then to go into the human side of that box and tick multiple in there that allows you to then focus in on that rather than the organisation and system.
When you've got somebody who's made a mistake and something's gone wrong, you tend to see two options as to what happens. First one is we blame the individual, and so that stops us from learning because we've got an explanation. John made a mistake. didn't isolate this thing, turned on that thing when he shouldn't have done. Explanation, problem solved. Yeah. The second one is that people get so wary of their explanation being about people and the mistakes they made that they just ignore it completely. And so there's never any explanation of how come people did the things they did, because we're trying to avoid blame at all costs. And it's hard to try and understand why people did what they did. The people who are doing these investigations, they're not psychologists, they're not social scientists. They don't have the expertise around how people do the things they do. And so they'd rather avoid it and go straight into talking about systems and processes and how our systems failed. And so you always feel like you're missing a big part of the explanation, which is, well, somebody or a group of people did something we wish they hadn't, and yet we haven't explained what that is or how come that came to be.
Something you said in there right at the start was, demonstrating care for people in the process. I mean, tell me more about your perspective of that, because that's what I've noticed every time I talk to you about investigations. Just the whole focus of the experience people have going through an investigation.
So I talk to lots of people about investigations and their experience of them, and one thing that springs to mind for me is when I was doing some training recently, and we talk at the beginning of the training about what's your experience of investigations, and you always get a big range of people who've got no experience to people who've got 20 years doing investigations. But this one person I was speaking to said, recently involved in an investigation, and it was a horrible experience. All I wanted to do was tell my story about what happened, but nobody was interested. I was asked a series of questions when I was providing a statement, and I just had to answer those. And at no stage in the whole process was I able to just say, here's how I felt, here's what happened, here's my story. And that's often what people want to do. They just want to be able to tell their story of the event. And if you've got multiple people involved, those stories might be different. And that's okay. They just want an opportunity to describe what happened and what their part in that was.
And it's important, right? Because if you want to, most of that data gathering stage is people's stories around what happened. So you do need to create a situation where people can actually tell their story, not just answer a bunch of questions from a compliance-orientated process. So, it's always really interesting when I listen to you about that, because it goes similar to just having conversations with people in the field. People go out with a set of questions and people just answer them, and we talk a lot about, we'll just go out and have a conversation with people and let people just tell what's going on and what's making sense to them. And it's the same process that should be going over into the investigation stage.
It is. It's all it takes is just to stop and have a conversation with somebody. We don't need statements. We don't need interview records, and we don't need to make this long list of questions we want to ask. We just want to find out who are the people who know something about this, and then go and sit with them, or walk with them to wherever something happened, and just say, hey, tell me what you need to tell me, and then listen. That is how we gather all of that information. But even before that happens, often what we don't do with investigations is think about who's actually hurt. Sometimes it's really obvious when there's very serious events. You've got somebody who's badly injured, there was people who are around them. We know those people need support, whether it's from an employee assistance provider or from their family, colleagues who know them well. They need help. That's kind of easy to work out that they need that. Sometimes organisations are not so good at getting that to them. But as the example I gave earlier, when we talked about how you just got somebody who's been an expert in their field, and after 10, 15 years they make a mistake, they need some help as well. They need an opportunity to tell their story about that and to maybe get some confidence back. There's always people who have been hurt in some way by the event that's occurred, and then often what will happen during the investigation process is we just make it worse by making them answer our questions, by making them feel bad about what they've done. And then you come to the end of the investigation and we produce some sort of report that says they should have known better, they should have done this, they shouldn't have done that. And the language that we use makes it really clear that we think that the problem is them.
Yeah, and it goes into that whole, rather than us just sharing what happened, it goes into an interrogation, and that's not a nice experience for anyone.
So. And is a very common experience for people.
I'd want to dip back into the learning-focused investigations. What are they, and what do they look like in practice?
So any investigation that you do has the opportunity to be more about learning and less about process, and relates back to some of the things we've talked about around the purpose of the investigation, our classification processes, the quantity of investigations that people have to do. All of these things mean that investigations become a compliance activity and more about getting the paperwork done than about learning. I'm not an expert on learning. Too often we don't bring in people who are experts on learning. Teachers, for example. They don't have a part to play in the way we think about safety in organisations. But it's very clear that what we usually do is not about learning, that it's not about people coming together, understanding something that's happened, and then working out a way that they can go and do things differently, be different as a consequence of that event. Our processes are not set up well to do that. You have things like learning teams are a step in the right direction in that they're about bringing people together. And so you ask what it looks like. To me, it looks like a group of people coming together with no fear about what they say and having someone help them facilitate a process whereby they can share openly their frustrations, their experience of the work they do, the organisation they're in, their own experience of sort of life at work, that enables you to understand something about that work that can be improved to make it easier. There needs to, if I'm thinking about what it looks like a lot less process than we currently use. Timelines, 5 whys, PIPO charts, ICAM charts, all of this stuff that goes with investigations, that's not learning.
So I agree with exactly what you said. A small example I've had a couple of times on site, coaching leaders, and someone's come to me and said, I'm completing an investigation and I'm trying to fill out the 5 whys. What would you put for this? So they're just worried about completing the process and getting the report through versus, well, what did the people say?
Yes.
Well, what do you mean? I said, well, I can't answer that. You can't answer that. The only people who can answer that are those who are involved with the work. And I guess that's the bit where we can move away from process and go more to learning, actually embrace the conversations with people.
Yes.
James, for those who are in roles already or stepping into roles where they're doing investigations, what's your best advice for them or a couple of tips?
So people who are involved in investigations, I think the most important thing you can start with is just be aware of who you are. Understand your own biases, your own preferences, your own views on what safety is, your own views on people, and when things go wrong, well, how do you think of people? One of the best questions that people can ask themselves as they get to the end of an investigation is, what surprised me? Because so often nothing surprises anyone in investigations. But if you ask yourself, so what surprised me? I think that's a good way to start thinking about who you are yourself and how you approach investigations. Second one for me would be at every stage of the investigation process is be thinking about people. Who's involved? How do they feel? How do I help them tell their story? What support do people need? Always about people, even when it comes to the sharing at the end. Who needs to know what about this event? How do we communicate with people in a way that's meaningful to them rather than just pump out the same sort of reports that we always do? The last, what should people think about, is just broaden your knowledge. Don't just go through, if you're a book reader, don't read the same old safety books. Go and look for things outside of the safety, the engineering world to broaden your horizon, because this is about people. And there's lots of people who know more about people than safety engineers. So go and find out some of that stuff. Go and get other experiences that will help you be better at understanding the impact of investigations on people.
I like that, because that's definitely our aim with this podcast in general, is to help broaden people's knowledge and bring people like yourself in and share that with the wider audience. James, thank you very much for joining us on the Fatality Free Future podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future hub on barclays.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.